Now, we suspected that Bob Ferguson, Attorney General Bob Ferguson, took things a little bit too far when he demanded that Washington's Secretary of State, Steve Hobbs, give him special treatment to make sure voters weren't confused about the two other Bob Fergusons who filed to run for governor as Democrats. Now, the other Bob Fergusons dropped out, probably under all these threats from the Attorney General Bob Ferguson that he would try to get his buddies in prosecutor's office to charge them with Class B felonies. But just a reminder, let me play the clip again. So Bob comes out. You guys know the story. Two other Bob Fergusons as Democrats filed to run at the last minute. So we're facing a situation where there's three Bob Fergusons as Democrats on the ballot. I don't blame Attorney General Bob Ferguson for losing his mind about it. Absolutely do not blame him for that at all. But in his anger and rage, he really showed us a lot about who he is, if we didn't know already, because he came out and he's like, if they don't drop out, I want all this special treatment from the Secretary of State's office, including actually reversing the order, changing the order that candidates for governor would appear on the ballot. Here's what he said.
After the drawing of straws on Friday afternoon, one of these Bob Fergusons will appear second on the ballot. The other will appear third on the ballot, and I appear number 13 on the ballot. So we're asking the Secretary of State to either move my name up, sort of second essentially, above those two, or move them down below me.
Now, when we saw that, I thought, that's illegal. You can't do that. By law, you go in and it's basically a draw of names, and you put, there's 30 candidates in the race for governor, and you get them, they get put in that order. And if you draw the short end of the stick, and man, you're 30th, like sucks to be you, but hopefully people really want to vote for you. And so Bob was all upset because he's like, you got two Bobs above me and I'm way down on the list. So why don't you take me and just move me up? Put me second on the ballot. Put me first, before the other Bobs. And I thought, I'm no lawyer, but that cannot be legal. That's insane. And it turns out I'm not the only one who thinks so. So there are a couple people now coming out and accusing Bob of asking the Secretary of State to break the law. Now, one of them is not so surprising. It is State Senator Mark Mullet, who is an opponent of Bob Ferguson's in the gubernatorial election. He's running as a Democrat, a more moderate Democrat. We've had him on the show before, and he spoke to the Washington State Standard. He said, I completely condemn what those two Bobs did. That said, it is shocking to see the Attorney General requesting other agencies to break the law. That's how bad he wants this office. This speaks directly to Bob Ferguson's character, and that should matter to every voter in the state, Mullet said. Ferguson responded to Mullet sharply, saying he, quote, does not know the law, and insisting there are provisions in state code providing Hobbs, the Secretary of State, authority to do what is needed to alleviate voter confusion, including revising the order of candidates on the ballot. This is what Bob Ferguson said of Mark Mullet, saying what you did was ask the Secretary of State to break the law. Bob said, it's unfortunate Mullet does not support this simple act for election integrity, but perhaps the fact that he would have benefited from that confusion explains his anti-democratic position. So it wouldn't be too surprising or alarming to have an opponent of Bob Ferguson accuse him of doing something wrong, right? To have an opponent of Bob Ferguson say that Bob took things too far, that he not only asked for special treatment, but he asked the Secretary of State to break the law on his behalf. What is interesting, and what is very noteworthy indeed today, is that the Democratic Secretary of State, Steve Hobbs, is echoing what Mark Mullet says. And he is saying, in no uncertain terms, that Bob Ferguson asked him to break the law on his behalf. This again from the Washington State Standard. So it takes you through the timeline of events, and this is all very interesting. It says on May 13th, Ferguson held a press conference in Seattle, the one we just played a clip from, vowing to see the Bobs prosecuted for violating an 81-year-old state law that makes it a felony to challenge someone with the same name and whose political reputation is widely known. That same day, Zachary Pecalis, Ferguson's attorney, sent a letter to Hobbs saying he must include occupations for all three and redo the ballot so the other Fergusons appeared behind the Attorney General. The order set by state election officials had Bob Arthur Ferguson of Yakima appearing second, Bob Benjamin Ferguson of Graham third, and Bob Ferguson of Seattle, the Attorney General, in the 13th spot. After getting the letter, Hobbs phoned Ferguson to let him know he would include occupations for each, but he would not mess with the order of names on the ballot. This is what Steve Hobbs, the Attorney General, a Democrat, told the Washington State Standard in an interview. Quote, "I was surprised he was asking me to do something that I clearly cannot do because it's in the law. He was very upset. It was a spirited conversation." And he went on to say that like a first-year law student would know that what Bob Ferguson was asking him to do was against the law. And it gets into this kind of confusing thing because there's RCW, which is state law. And then there's WAC, or the WAC, which is administrative code. And so the law clearly states that you have this method to list candidates on the ballot that's a random draw. And there's this WAC code that says basically the Secretary of State has a lot of leeway in helping avoid voter confusion, but state law takes precedent over the WAC. And what Steve Hobbs is saying is, you'd think the Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, would know that. You know, he actually picks up the phone and tells Bob, I can't do that. And he said the result was a very spirited conversation. And I just want to note also, we have the letter. We have obtained the letter that Bob Ferguson's campaign sent to the Secretary of State's office. It's dated May 13th. And in it, he directs him. He doesn't ask him. He outright directs him to violate the law. He says, to mitigate voter confusion, you must adjust the order in which the three candidates' names appear on the ballot. You must adjust the order. There it is in black and white, undeniable. The Attorney General of the state of Washington asking the Secretary of State to violate the law on his behalf to help him in an election for governor. If that's not a scandal, I don't know what is. Now, I'm going to have more from that letter coming up in a moment, but first, I asked State Senator Mark Mullet, who again is a opponent of Bob Ferguson in the election, who has been very outspoken about what he sees as some of Bob Ferguson's character flaws, like this one, where he'll do anything to get elected governor. So I asked him to come on the show today and weigh in on what Bob asked of the Secretary of State. Mark Mullet, welcome back to Undivided.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
All right.
Happy to be back.
Look, the three Bobs thing, a little funny. A little funny?
Yeah, funny, but also annoyingly stupid. Like, I think it was not, we want to make people have faith and confidence in our elections, and we shouldn't be doing anything that would detract from that. And I think you, to your credit, highlighted that on your own show. And I think it was a powerful message to say, hey, we don't want anything that confuses voters. We want everything to be on the up and up.
Yeah, and I would have been livid if it had been done to you, if it had been done to Dave Reichert. So it's a little bit of moral consistency. But I did have a good giggle about it when it happened. And then I, moved on. So when Bob Ferguson came out and he had this press conference with three things that he expected or was going to ask of the Secretary of State's office if these two Bobs did not bow out, which they eventually did any of those things immediately kind of raise your alarm bells, or did you feel like you had to look into it a little bit?
Well, the third one immediately raised alarm bells because to me, it was very clear, I think, and I came out publicly saying I thought the two Bobs should withdraw their names from the ballot because I didn't think it was doing anything to help the situation. But the first one was very clear. Like, you can put people's occupation in there. The RCW clearly states that is what you do if you have two people by the same name list their occupation. The RCW also clearly states you do not rearrange the ballot order if there's multiple people of the same name to favor the one that happens to be currently in office. I mean, that is a clear violation of the law, and it's really shocking to me. Their own Attorney General was asking a state agency to blatantly break the law for his own personal benefit.
Yeah, and he's saying that essentially you don't understand the law. And then he turned around and said that Steve Hobbs doesn't understand the law on this either. So do you guys both just collectively have no idea what you're talking about?
Well, I called Phil Talmadge. He's a former, Supreme Court justice in the state of Washington, because Bob's right. I'm not a lawyer. I sell pizza and ice cream for a living, so he's got me dead to rights of me not being a lawyer. But I do know lawyers, and so I called who I thought is a very competent, highly respected lawyer, and I said, "Hey, what's the situation here?" He didn't even have any shadow of a doubt. He said it is crystal clear. The RCW always takes precedent over a whack. And Bob was referencing in his letter a whack. And so the Washington Administrative Code never can supersede what's in the revised Code of Washington. Bob knows that. I think Bob knows that. And it really is disappointing that he just wants this office so bad. So bad. He's willing to do anything. It doesn't matter who gets in the way. And I think he has gotten to the point where he's literally asking state agencies to break the law so it can work in his favor.
Yeah, and that was Steve Hobbs, again, a Democrat, the Secretary of State. His read on it, too, he said it doesn't take a first-year law student to know that, referring to RCW has to come before WAC. So he's getting a little dig in on Bob Ferguson, and Bob's argument is, well, the Secretary of State supports your campaign, and so he's just giving, a read of the rules, that's not going to benefit me. Is there any of that? Are you and Steve Hobbs in cahoots?
Not at all. That was the most ridiculous insinuation ever. So basically, Bob gets caught red-handed asking a state agency to break the law, and now he's trying to insinuate that there's some conspiracy, and it's complete nonsense.
Yeah. And I don't know Steve Hobbs well, but I got a chance to sit in his office and chat with him about some concerns I had around signature gatherers being harassed. And although he and I disagree on a few things, he doesn't strike me as the kind of person who would use his office to do favors for his friends. So, I don't know where Bob's coming from on that either.
The Secretary of State, Steve Hobbs, had made it crystal clear. He was going to put professions next to those names.
Yeah.
He was going to make sure the voters knew which Bob was which. And so Steve Hobbs 100% planned to follow the law. And so to his credit, Secretary of State Steve Hobbs was in the right on this issue. Attorney General Bob Ferguson was in the wrong on this issue. And now I think it's going to be really interesting. There's a lot of lawyers in our state. I look forward to them weighing in on Bob's request, because I think it would be helpful for voters to understand, because like I highlighted, I think it speaks to his character.
Do you want some sort of action to be taken against Bob for that?
I mean, hopefully the action is just people realize this is his character. He wants an office so bad. And this is, to me, I always say, what people get really frustrated about with politicians is they're more concerned about getting reelected than they are about doing the right thing. We are already seeing Bob's true colors. He's so concerned about getting elected. It's not about doing the right thing. It's what do I do to help me get elected? And, that goes back to the chicken checks, and it goes back to what we saw a week ago with this letter to Secretary of State Steve Hobbs. And to me, this is really important for voters to understand, because I always feel my strong suit in this office is I've always put what is good public policy, the right thing, first. That's actually made my own political life extremely difficult more often than not. But I'm proud of the fact that I've always done what I think is right, even when it creates my own political misery.
Yeah, you've had a lot of political misery, haven't you? Poor Mark Mullet. That's all right. But no, I think what's unique about this is, I'm obviously not a Bob fan. I talk about it a lot on the show. You obviously have a dog in the fight because you're in the race against him. But for Steve Hobbs to come out and say, he asked me to do something that I cannot do under the law, I think is a really significant development in this. One more issue I want to talk to you about before we let you go, just because the last time we had you on, this hadn't happened yet. You decided to talk to the Seattle Times. I don't know if they got the document elsewhere and reached out to you or what the situation was, but essentially the state Democratic Party sold its endorsement in the governor's race. I mean, that's how I see it, for $1 million. And you didn't have $1 million to give them. So it seems like they knew that, and that's why they went about doing this, because they don't typically do this, right? Pre-primary, allow a candidate.
Completely unprecedented. It hasn't happened in the other races. And I think it just sets a horrible example. Right now it's two white guys, so be it. But what happens when it's the white male who happens to be in office, has to be sitting on millions of dollars of surplus campaign cash or their own campaign funds they built up, and now it's a female minority who's running against them, and all of a sudden you can just buy the endorsement. I mean, I think the precedent looks really, really bad.
Well, do you think it was, and I might be like, I'm going to put my tinfoil hat on, and feel free to tell me if you think that I'm crazy. But when I look at this, like, clearly you have a situation where they're going to support Bob. He's got the money. So if they do, oh, we're doing an early buy-in, Mark, here's your chance. You know, you just have to give us $1 million. We'll consider you. But they knew you didn't have $1 million to give. But then you mentioned the surplus campaign funds. So he has this situation where he's got these surplus campaign funds that he might not be able to roll into his current election endeavor because it would surpass election limits. So now he has a place to put that money. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it's really dodgy. I think what we saw a year ago is Bob transferred over all his AG surplus money into the governor's race. The Public Disclosure Commission came out and said, you are basically violating the intent of the law, which is everyone is capped at $4,800 per person. He had numerous individuals that were transferring over way more than $4,800 per person. So when he undid all the money that was above that legal limit, he had to return $1.2 million out of his governor's account back to his attorney general's account. And the whole intent of that was that money was not supposed to be used towards the governor's race. I mean, that was very clear. That's why they had him return it. If they didn't care if it was used in the governor's race, they would have just said, just keep it in your governor's account. And now what we have is this backdoor way, because Bob didn't pay this $1 million buyout for the endorsement. He didn't pay it out of his governor's campaign account. He paid it out of the account that the Public Disclosure Commission made him return out of his governor account. So he paid it out of this other AG surplus account. And yeah, he just managed to basically circumvent, once again, the intent of the law, which was we want to cap people's individual donations at $4,800.
Wow. So it sounds politically like nerdy and insider baseball, but the money that he paid, to get the $1 million buy-in for the early endorsement came out of the AG's the surplus funds.
It came out of the pot of money the PDC made him remove from his governor's account and send back.
That's
so
more
the
than
money
dodgy.
He specifically, and this wasn't me, right? This was Hillary France. Like at this point, I hadn't even announced for governor. So this was between Bob Ferguson and Hillary France, where Hillary France, to her credit, was accurately pointing out he's clearly violating the intent of the law because he's transferring way more than $4,800 per person. I mean, to have $1.2 million he had to send back. And yes, he has now basically laundered that money into the governor's race through a back door.
Wild. It's wild. And this is the kind of stuff the average voter needs to know about. And that's why I always tell you, I said, we're rolling in the same direction on this, because one of my biggest flaws I find in Bob Ferguson is everything he does and says or doesn't do and doesn't say is a political calculation for him. How does it benefit me? How does it benefit my political ambitions and my political career? And that's just not someone who I want in the governor's office. And both of these stories are a reflection of that. So Mark Mullet, we appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll have you back on soon.
Hey, I'm happy to be on. Thank you very much, Brandi.
Shady stuff. I don't know how to get it across. Like, what you tell me, how do we reach more voters who are inclined to support Bob Ferguson, to let them know about the dangers of these sorts of things, about someone with that much power seeking even more power, who wants rules bent to his favor, who wants to circumvent rules. And again, every calculation, everything for him is a political calculation. And I want to read one more part that's kind of unrelated to what we just discussed from this letter that, again, Bob Ferguson's campaign sent the Secretary of State on May 13th, demanding this special treatment, that if the other two Bobs don't get off the ballot, here's everything you must do for me. One of them I just found to be incredibly petty. So one thing that the Secretary of State could do, and said he would do, is put their profession next to their name so people could differentiate. He has the authority under law to do that. And in this letter, Bob Ferguson told him how the names, how it should appear. It said you must identify, A.G. Ferguson as Attorney General. So he didn't even want it to be attorney. He wanted it to say Attorney General Bob Ferguson. But then the attorney in this letter went on to say the campaign is currently unaware of either fraudulent candidate's current occupation. So they were saying, essentially, we don't know how you need to refer to their occupation because we're unsure what their occupations even are. And you know how they call him a fraudulent candidate. But get this. It says, as for fraudulent candidate Robert Benjamin Ferguson, it says, he's a military veteran. It says military veteran is neither an occupation nor a profession, but rather a status. The ballot should state his current occupation or profession, not any legally protected characteristic. So Bob is so petty. Attorney General Bob Ferguson is so petty, is so worried about, even if you differentiate them by occupation, some people might be more inclined to support a military veteran than to support the Attorney General, that he's saying, I don't know what you should call him, but you can't call him a veteran. Like, does that just not show a level of pettiness that someone who served our country, you're saying, well, that's not an occupation. That's a characteristic. So you can put Attorney General for me, but you can't put military veteran next to that guy's name. People, wake up. Anyone but Bob.